So greetings, and Amy, I'm going to say this not to embarrass you, but to reassure my friend Liz that she's not the only one who has mispronounced my last name for years. It's actually Krakoff, and now you can forget that, because really people I've been friends with for decades say it wrong, but my husband always gives me a hard time, so there it is. That's my...
I accept any pronunciation.
So greetings. So I'm going to start... So this is the name of my talk, and it's a framing, so take a look, and then I'll come back to it. But I'm going to start with a couple of pictures and a question. So there's one picture, and here's another. So the question is this a sacred place? These are photos I took over spring break out on the Navajo Nation. and greetings and thank you for your words yesterday, which unfortunately I missed. My daughter and I were there helping a nonprofit install solar panels on homes belonging to 3 siblings of the Yellow Horse family. They live on the westernmost part of the reservation, which is just east of the Marble Canyon stretch of the Grand Canyon. For decades, the federal government forbade the Yellow Horses and their neighbors from undertaking any substantial improvements to their dwellings under a policy known as the Bennett Freeze. The Yellow Horses and many other families have no electricity, no running water, and live many miles from the nearest pavement. While the Yellow Horses surely objected to the federal government's inhumane policy, they would never leave this land. Their religious, spiritual, and cultural lives are intimately connected to where they live, the places they know, the creation stories, and ceremonies that center around how these places came to be and how to tend to them. To most non-Indians, the sacred likely does not look like this. I'm just going to hazard a guess. If the term describes anything terrestrial, it looks more like this. This is the Grand Canyon from the South Rim. I took this picture on the same road trip, within the national park boundaries, which lie just west of the Yellow Horses family homes. If you walk due west from the Yellow Horse family homes, you'd be in Marble Canyon, and then eventually you get down to the inner gorge. I want to start with these contrasting images to set out a central tension in the relationship between religion and environmentalism, and that is between religious conceptions themselves. One person's vision of the sacred, while unassailable on its own terms, may depend on the erasure of the sacred lives of others. I'm going to leave that thought for now, but I'm going to circle back around to it at the end. So now that I'm already partway in, I want to thank Lincoln and the other conference organizers for having me here. You provided me with the opportunity to mull over many recurring notions. Ideas about spirituality and faith pervade my thinking about natural resources and environmental issues. And in part, this is because I don't know how I feel about the role that they do or should play. And so I think in this way, some of what I have to say will echo what Jed said, but probably in a different register. On one hand, reason and its cognates, empiricism and economics, among others, are not enough to explain our attachment to the non-human aspects of our world, nor to motivate action on their behalf. Something more emotional and visceral is at play. At the same time, non-negotiable commands from unaccountable sources of authority make me extremely uneasy, yet these are at least arguably aspects of our mainstream religions. If we take away reason and ask people to go on faith, we leave ourselves open to command by dogma. Some of the same tensions that pervade my thoughts about the religion side of the religion and environment discussion also infiltrate the environment side. On one hand, environmentalism is a movement born of rationality and science. The more the Western world learned about the relationships between species, how ecosystems work, the long-term effects of chemicals, just to name a few topics, the greater the concern about humanity's outsized effects on the planet. Knowledge, particularly from science, seemed to drive the environmental movement. On the other, of course, and we've been hearing about this for a day and a half, facts alone do not make an environmentalist. There are a lot of ways to react to facts about habitat degradation, species loss, and so forth. Not all of them lead to behaviors, policies, and laws that protect the non-human environment. The fact-value connection remains mysterious despite centuries of philosophers trying to work that out. So the relationship between religion and environmentalism is replete with larger questions about the limits of rationality, the sources of human values, and whether reason or faith, or neither, can shape our values or change our behavior. So against that inauspicious backdrop, here are my thoughts on these matters, at least as of today. I'm going to describe first a few ways that mainstream religions relate to environmental protection, and that will lead to a few thoughts about Native American religious and cultural practices, about which I'm not an expert. I'm just an observer. Then I will conclude with my best attempt to articulate some larger insights from the foregoing, which I fear will leave us with nothing better than a heightened sense of the hard and insoluble questions at the heart of the relationship between religion and environmentalism. So what's the relationship between environmentalism and mainstream religions? Is there one? Yes, and it's of two sorts, complementary and hostile. The complementary one takes at least three forms, and for labeling purposes, I call these religion as template, nature as conduit for religion, and religion as source for pro-environment or ecocentric values. So first, in the religion as template category, religious training or sensibility can prefigure fierce devotion to nature. Here, religion's content, texts, and moral teachings are not themselves the wellspring of environmental consciousness. Rather, religion serves as a template for a subsequent transference of reverence from God and the church to nature. There are examples throughout our environmental history of leading figures whose backgrounds included a strict religious upbringing. John Wesley Powell, intrepid explorer of the Colorado River and author of the Arid Lands Report, whose prescient work was recovered from history's dustbin by the namesake of this center, was raised by a Methodist preacher. Powell's father was also a fierce abolitionist who wanted John Wesley to follow him into the ministry. Instead, Powell was lured away by the mysteries of nature and science, eventually becoming just as spirited a proselytizer as his father, but for the cause of applying science to resource planning. John Muir, founder of the Sierra Club, an early popularizer of hiking, climbing, and exploring in wild places, was also raised in a very religious household. Muir's father's strict approach to child rearing included the belief that the Bible was the only book that anyone needed to study, although according to one writer, quote, he did relent when he could be persuaded of the strong moral purpose of a work, so Milton and Shakespeare were also permitted. Which is funny about Shakespeare, I think, in particular. Muir himself abandoned organized religion and yet described his love of the natural world in ecstatic religious terms. As the same writer put it, John Muir belonged to no church, yet he was intensely religious. His approach to all nature was worshipful. And one could pick any number of passages of his writings, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with them, so I'll just read a few lines from one, from a view of the High Sierra. So this is Muir. Now came the silent evening. Long blue spiky shadows crept out across the snowfields, while a rosy glow, at first scarce discernible, gradually deepened and suffused every mountaintop, fleshing the glaciers and the harsh crags above them. This was the alpenglow, to me one of the most impressive of all the terrestrial manifestations of God. At the touch of this divine light, the mountains seemed to kindle to a rapt religious consciousness and stood hushed and waiting like devout worshipers. So that was Muir, and he sounds a lot like several of the speakers we've heard today who come from within a religious tradition. Contemporary examples of the religion as template relationship exist as well. Julia Butterfly Hill, famous for her 2 years of living in an ancient redwood tree in Northern California, was raised by a traveling preacher. As a child, she and her family moved from town to town, living in a 32-foot camper as her father delivered the good word to different communities. Her itinerant early life and her father's example of faith and fervor imprinted and transferred over to her commitment to the natural world. And in her memoir called Luna, which is the tree that she sat in for 2 years, she describes her tree sit as creation's response to her prayer for guidance. So those are just a few of many possible examples of this type of relationship between mainstream religion and environmentalism. The second sort of complementary relationship is when nature serves as the conduit for a religious worldview that is otherwise grounded in mainstream religion. In the Anglo-American tradition, the best example is that of the Transcendentalists. Emerson and Thoreau used nature as a means through which to develop their notion of God and their progressive ideas about individual liberty and freedom. Transcendentalism was an attempt by Emerson and others to respond both to Humean skepticism, so early empirical skepticism, as well as to incorporate German philosophical idealism into an American tradition. Emerson seized on the idea that the individual human mind could itself be the source of religious insight and revelation if it learned to see natural objects in the right way. At the beginning of his essay, Nature, Emerson wrote, quote, "Why should we not have a poetry and philosophy of insight and not of tradition, and a religion by revelation to us and not the history of theirs?" Thoreau took the general transcendentalist notion that through nature the mind could access a higher plane and grounded it in the very specific and granular objects of nature, the trees, rocks, birds, and seeds that he came to know during his nearly 3 years living at Walden Pond. Walden, which has become a manifesto for the modern environmental movement, is laced throughout with this transcendentalist approach and idea. Thoreau is open to life and its sensory experiences, but he accesses them through a decidedly cultural and intellectual frame. His conception of what is wild, and therefore wonderful, includes turns of mind, literature, including some but not all Shakespeare, again, and other human actions and artifacts. And Thoreau also marries objective rationality with subjective experience, noting in a chapter titled Higher Laws that, quote, "We are most interested when science reports what men already know, practically or instinctively, for that alone is a true humanity or account of human experience." So the third complementary form is that mainstream religions may find within their texts, traditions, customs, and rituals support for an ecological sensibility. And I'm not going to say much more on that, since it's been the subject of much of this conference with people much more learned and knowledgeable than I about the sources within their own traditions for an ecological worldview. I distinguish this from the second category because in these examples, the starting point is the religious tenets and texts as they are given. The Transcendentalists, by contrast, were struggling to articulate a new kind of religious understanding, which interestingly never really caught on, and we might talk about that later. So they were starting from certain insights they had about the natural world and then taking them to expand on their idea of God rather than sort of the other way around. It's not surprising that each of these complements exist, even when they spring from religious worldviews that, at least according to Lynn White's early version of his thesis, have core tenets that are at odds with the land ethic. Religion gives us a code of living, and more importantly for many, a reason to follow it. Religious training is, or at least is supposed to be, a grounding in core moral beliefs that equip people to act ethically, consistent with those beliefs. Religion also provides us with recourse to non-rational modes of knowing and understanding. Wonder, joy, and ecstasy are states facilitated by, or at least encouraged by, many religions. The same states many believe to be inspired by nature and also necessary to motivate its safekeeping and protection. The challenges for environmentalism in terms of motivating people to act, which include that harms can be remote in time and space, and that much of what we know only in the abstract through science, seem to call for the kind of upright character and capacity for wonder that certain kinds of religious training produce. Being a good environmentalist on a daily basis seems to call, in other words, for a certain kind of faith, a certain kind of reason, and a certain kind of discipline, all of which can come from religious training and religious sensibility. But some aspects of environmentalism can be at odds with religious faith and vice versa. So is there a relationship between environmentalism and religion? The answer is yes, as above, but instead of complementary, the relationship is a hostile one. Lynn White's thesis, of course, describes the relationship between Christianity and environmentalism as a hostile one, and I won't rehearse that here except to summarize, right? He argued that the central beliefs and commands of Christianity, particularly when combined with our scientific and technological dominance after the Industrial Revolution, lead inexorably to ecological and environmental destruction. Many, including many of you here, have challenged White's characterization in important ways, including that it overgeneralized, and he himself has walked back from that a bit. Yet, despite the many important responses to White, it's clear that some strains of mainstream religions continue to have hostile relationships with environmentalism. The hostility is often rooted in antipathy to science, and more recently, scientists themselves, a disturbing phenomenon. We have seen this in some fundamentalist Christian reactions to climate science, as well as in the battles over evolution and its implications for geology, biology, chemistry, and other disciplines. Hostility to science is most directly correlated to hostility to environmentally protective frames of thought in the climate change context, but it's incipient in the general resistance to science as well. The recent emergence of hostility to science has much earlier roots. The Catholic Church's rejection of Copernican insights and persecution of Galileo for embracing them provides just one of many possible historical examples. In these contexts, we see the dangers of faith and the downsides of obedience to religious authority, particularly an authority that is not responsive to reasoned exchange or debate. Faith that is beyond reason in these ways compounds the problems that inhere in environmental protection mentioned above. The temporal and spatial lags between action and harm, the abstract quality of much of what we know about environmental damage and how it works, these same features that religious faith can overcome to further environmentally protective action can also compound the problem of faith substituting for reason. If God is in charge and the command is to use the Earth's resources, then there is all the more reason to set aside these remote and unpleasant facts about our impacts on the Earth. So if one poses these same questions, is there a relationship between nature and religion, and should there be in the context of American Indian religions? The answer to the first part is an easy yes, there's a relationship. Not only that, the relationship composes the religious and cultural worldview, a relationship that with the non-human world is one of the central organizing principles of most native religions. This makes the second question, should there be, somewhat irrelevant. It also makes the nature of the relationship a different thing entirely, at least according to my understanding. While it's easy to say that mainstream religions are both complementary and hostile to an environmentalist or ecocentric worldview, neither of these adjectives applies in the native context. Indigenous religion is not merely complementary to an environmental worldview, it is an environmental worldview. Here, for example, is how Amy Bowers and Kristen Carpenter describe the Yurok, Karuk, and Tolowa religions in their chapter on the infamous case of Ling versus Northwest Cemetery Association, in which the Supreme Court denied protection to the tribe's sacred high country in Northern California. This is Kristen and Amy describing. And Amy is a Yurok tribal member and religious practitioner. Like most religions, the tribal religion creates social standards that govern the human interaction with the sacred. But unlike many other religions, the sacred was not found in heaven. Rather, it was here on earth. Consistent with the tribal worldview, the religion contemplated roles for the people, the land, water, plants, and animals in the tribe's aboriginal territories. The sacred flowed through these things, empowering them with a life force capable of assisting humans in their struggles to heal the sick, create peace, and ensure continuance of the natural world. For the Yurok, law, cultural covenants, and religious and spiritual teachings were intertwined, all rooted in a mutual relationship with the land, water, and other species. Humans had obligations daily and annually, regularly, all the time, to participate in ceremonies that would perpetuate these relationships. And while it's perilous to generalize, scholars of indigenous religion, including Vine Deloria, Rebecca Tsosie, and others, describe similar traits at the core of most native religious worldviews and practices. What Native American place-based religions do not do, however, is lock in a static, atavistic, romanticized understanding of natural resource use, nor do they guarantee that serious and learned practitioners of native religions will all be quote-unquote environmentalists in the sense that most non-Indians understand the term. So how can this be? Well, first, sincere adherents of religions that revolve around honoring and taking care of particular places can nonetheless fail to live up to their religious and cultural norms all the time, just as we all do. So do all Catholics act Catholic all the time? Does no one ever sin, commit crimes, lie, cheat, steal, and so forth, even if they're devoutly religious? The answer is obviously no. And yet in mainstream religious contexts, failure to live up to our unattainable religious ideals rarely results in accusations that the religion itself is not real, which is a refrain one hears sometimes in the context of native religion. A religion can be real in whatever sense religious beliefs are real, even if its followers are imperfect, i.e. human. Second, taking care of places through ceremonies and tending the land, the waters, the plants, and the creatures as part of one's spiritual and cultural reality are their own ends, even if the places are no longer pristine. Built into many native religions, in other words, is a flexibility about the objects of the natural world. They are there to be used, even if they are also there to be known and cared for. The use and care are not separate. Third, today, most native people must make hard economic choices, and Liz alluded to this yesterday too, and operate within the system of market-based resource exploitation that the rest of us do. It is always disappointing to environmental outsiders when tribes opt for resource extraction as a means of economic development, but for tribes the situation is one of acting as agents to meet the needs of their peoples and their lands within a framework of constricted choices. So native religions will fall short if the aim is to harness them to protect the environment in the same way that mainstream religions will fall short. Humans are fallible and will never live up to their religious ideals completely. In addition, non-Indians who look to Native people to serve the role of environmentally perfect others, trapped in time and space, in order to nurture our dreams of a pre-industrial green utopia, are in denial of historical, social, and economic realities. And yet, it's also true that Native religious worldviews have the potential to serve us very well. If you spend time with Native people who know their land, their culture, and their religion, if you visit them, live with them, go hiking or hunting with them, and sleep on their land, you will know in your bones that knowing and taking care of a place, loving it, and tending it through ritual and ceremony, regardless of how damaged it is at the core of that worldview. It is in that way that Native religions have much to teach us about how to navigate the damaged world we inhabit and the increasingly more tattered one to come. So finally, I want to circle back to the discussion of mainstream religions. Should there be a relationship between religion and environmentalism in the context of the dominant religions? For the reasons discussed above, on one hand, the answer must be yes. The late Christopher Hitchens aside, most people gravitate toward religion, or at least some kind of faith. Religion provides a refuge from the confusing welter of facts that fly at us, organizes us into cohesive cultural groups, gives us guidance and sustenance beyond what the material world can offer, and provides access to transcendent states, such as wonder. Religion also provides a place for those who have uncanny abilities to guide us through life's moral and ethical thickets, as well as those whose ecstatic visions and devotions lead us by unattainable example. And we've heard from some people like this at this conference, and it's irreplaceable. Rabbis, imams, reverends, the best of them have what we now call emotional intelligence and practical wisdom. And the lives of saints often read like the lives of Thoreau, Muir, and Julia Butterfly Hill. Why not have a place for those with access to this plane beyond reason? And why not add to their portfolio the health of the planet, the fate of the marbled murrelet and the polar bear, and our great, I think that's 7 generations, grandchildren. So now I'm almost done, but I have to loop back here. On the other hand, when we abandon reason for faith, we risk binding ourselves to the effects of our actions. If what we do is supercharged by a vision that cannot be assailed, it's all too easy to plow over the visions of others. I should be clear that ideologies that marginalize non-conforming peoples and practices are not restricted to the religious ones. There are lots of examples of non-religious ideologies that have run roughshod over other peoples and ideas. So it's not just religion that can do that. But religion can bring a special unassailability and sense of righteousness and difficulty of derailing to that kind of action once it's set in motion. But I'm going to end here actually not by focusing on the mainstream religions themselves, but on mainstream environmentalism and the aspects of it that are themselves religious. Anti-environmentalists have sometimes labeled environmentalism as its own religion, and they mean that as an epithet. But if at some level, as discussed at the outset and all through this conference, we all rely on something like faith to help us order our values, then I think the charge is accurate, though it should be stripped of its accusatory tone. The problem is that environmental or ecological faith, a faith that seems to be grounded in facts about our world, is nonetheless susceptible to the very same blindness as religious faith. This is clear in the context of the views of one of our great conservation heroes, discussed here already, and interestingly infused with a religious background, John Muir. So here's Muir describing the Yosemite people, who were indigenous to the Yosemite Valley that Muir extolled and loved. Quote, "From no point of view that I have found are such debased fellow beings a whit more natural than the glaring, tailored tourists we saw that frightened the birds and the squirrels," end quote. Muir further commented that the Yosemite, quote, "seemed sadly unlike nature's neat, well-dressed animals," and concluded that, quote, "the worst thing about them is their uncleanliness, that nothing truly wild is unclean." Muir did not dwell on this problem of the Yosemite people's unclean and unwild presence. He did not have to, because he assumed that they would shortly disappear. And he writes, "It is when the deer are coming down that the Indians set out on their grand fall hunt. Too lazy to go into the recesses of the mountains away from the trails, they wait for the deer to come out and waylay them. But the Indians are passing away here as everywhere, and their red camps on the mountains are fewer every year." Muir was correct, tragically so, for the Yosemite people themselves, There are no more Yosemite people in what is now our national park. And similar stories of elimination or near elimination can be told of Yellowstone, the Grand Canyon, Glacier, Death Valley, and the Badlands, though in the case of some of these places, we can report quite happily today that tribes are regaining management or co-management. In Muir's case, his religious vision of what was good and right for the natural world allowed him not to see that another vision, a vision held by the Yosemite people and rooted in their ecological, religious, and spiritual worldview, was being erased. So where does that leave us? Muir was a man of his time, and by bringing attention to these troubling aspects of his views, I don't mean to disparage or cast aside the positives, which are many. And I love Muir and his writing, and I wouldn't have read a passage if I didn't. So it's not that he's like a bad person. He was a person of his time. But if we cannot see the harm that faith can do, even while we extol its virtues, then I think we should conclude that we are no better off commingling faith and environmentalism than separating them. Since separation, I believe, is impossible, all we can do is attempt to be vigilant about evaluating the sources of our faith and its effects on the world. We must go back and forth, in other words, between faith and reason, between values and facts, between belief and skepticism constantly. This sounds exhausting, but the risks of relaxing into an easy faith are worse. If religion is an excuse to stop questioning and thinking, then I think its relationship with environmentalism or any set of political goals should be severed. If religion can tolerate its own limitations, if we can welcome challenges to its precepts and still provide the comfort that it seems to, then bring it on. So thanks for indulging me in a few extra minutes.